Hey, I'm Alex Radcliffe from Board Game Co, and today I'm reviewing the Search from Planet X from Renegade Games. And the Search for Planet X is a deduction game as you try to figure out what's going on in this galaxy, trying to find Planet X, although that's not the only goal. You see, you don't win by finding Planet X, you simply get a bunch of points for it, which means you really just want to figure out and deduce as much as possible in the game, as you slowly submit theories as to what you think is going on, theories that will earn you points if you're right and cost you turns if you're wrong, and then ultimately, eventually, the game end will be triggered when someone does figure out where Planet X is, and more specifically what's on each side of it, so you just can't guess exactly what's going on. Now the game is going to go through a sequence of rounds as you take actions trying to figure things out. Like I said already, you're going to earn points to different things. You're going to be looking at this galaxy, which will have different states as far as what's happening over here. States that will be defined by the app. This is an app-based game. You will need an app to drive the core mechanism of everything happening in the game, to generate that first random galaxy, as well as to drive the actions you take. Now every single sector, 18 in the expert mode, 12 in the basic mode, every single sector has one thing from a variety of possible things. They could have comets, they could have asteroids, you could have dwarf planets, you could have empty space, you could have Planet X, but it's only one thing. Now part of the trickiness of Planet X is Planet X appears to be empty space. Some of the sectors could just be empty. That's the thing that they could be. They could be an empty sector. But then when you look at a planet, when you look at a sector and say, hey, that's empty, it might actually be Planet X, which is where the rules of the game, the rules of the objects in the game, start to define what is actually going on. You see, every single object has different rules around it. Empty space appears to be empty, but may not be. Dwarf comets will not be next to Planet X, so if you see empty space, but you know a dwarf comet is next to it, well then you know Planet X is not next to that space. You're going to have certain sectors that comets can be in, you'll have certain sectors that asteroids can be in, and the slow deduction and elimination of different things will drive your knowledge of the game. Along the way, you can take different actions in the game. You can take scanning actions, which will tell you which objects are in which sectors. You can say, hey, I want you to scan sectors 1 through 6 for comets. And the game will tell you, the app will tell you, there are 2 comets in those sectors, which starts leading to you start writing down information on your little player sheet. We have 2 set up over here, writing down your information, trying to figure out what's going on. You'll start doing research conferences, which will say things like, hey, by the way, Planet X is across from an asteroid. Well, that really helps you. Once you narrow down those 4 asteroids, you now know one of 4 sectors Planet X is in. And we also know that Planet X appears empty, so if 2 of those sectors appear as empty space and the other 2 aren't, well, we've now limited it down to 2 spaces where Planet X can be. And then from there, you can try to figure out, maybe there's a dwarf comet on the side of one of those, which means we now know that Sector 13 is Planet X, Sector 14 is a comet, and Sector 12 is empty space. Basically, you're trying to deduce what's happening. Now, as this board turns over here, you can only really take scanning actions towards the open space, but as the board turns, you're slowly going to be submitting theories around the board, which will lock in what's happening. You'll submit a theory saying, I believe that this sector is a comet, an asteroid, a dwarf planet, a whatever, and you're going to slowly move up the theories as the game progresses, eventually flipping them over and finding out publicly for all at the table whether you're wrong or right. If you're wrong, well, you lose a turn, and I mean, you lose an action turn. It's the turn economy of the game. If you're right, you'll get points, and those points are going to be key because you get a chunk of points for finding Planet X, but it's not the be-all and end-all. If you play well across the rest of the game, you may not find Planet X, and you'll still have more studies, more peer-reviewed studies that have been completed that you got points for that give you the win in Planet X. And that's basically the game. You play on standard, you can play it expert, you can play it solo, you can dive into this game in a variety of different ways, but the core idea is you're given a simulated game state at the beginning of the game from the app, a one-of-a-kind universe, and then you have to figure out what that universe actually looks like. As far as ease of play, the game is very easy to learn, rulebook's very short and accessible, easy to dive into, easy to teach. The peer review part, I find people take a second to really gather what's going on, especially because of the title, The Search for Planet X. People get a little fixated on searching for Planet X, and you really have to drive home the idea that is just but one of many factors in terms of winning the game, and you really need to lock down this peer review and execute upon it, and actually take those studies when you can, whether you're right or wrong. The cost of moving a space backwards is nowhere near as bad as the potential upside you will lose if you don't get those points, and so often, trying to go for a peer review will make the difference between winning or losing. Table space is minimal, and game time is fairly reasonable. I mean, table space is the board, you have one of these for each player, not a lot of table space. The game time usually comes in, I would say almost always under an hour. It can drag sometimes, but almost always under an hour, and if you're playing it solo, like, 30-40 minutes tops. And so this is a game that's fairly accessible in terms of, well, all accounts, from rules to teach to playtime to table space. Then from there, player count. This is a 1 to 4 player game. I have played this at 1, 2, and 3 players. I have not played it at 4. I've enjoyed it at all player counts, so all of them work fine, although it does play out a little differently, different counts. Solo, you're basically playing against the app itself. The app will generate a bot that moves around the board doing things against you, so you're trying to compete against the bot, and playing it at 2 and 3 work fine. I would say lower player counts is a drop better in my opinion, just gauging from the difference between 2 and 3. because of the fact that you're not really that invested in other players' turns. I'll get to that more in this review, but effectively the game is mostly multiplayer solitaire. You're doing your own little investigation as far as finding out what's going on in the galaxy. The other players' peer review studies are going to be the biggest impact they have, as some study that they started, you eventually find out what's right or wrong in the game. And so since it's mostly multiplayer solitaire, other players just add to the delay and the game time as they take their turns. Not a big difference. The difference between 2 and 3 players I would say was minimal, but I think 2 players is probably better than 4, and 3 is probably better than 4 if that's the case. And again, interaction is minimal. As far as what I like, don't like, and can see others not liking in the game, starting off with the fact that there's a lot of pathways towards the deduction. From the core scanning actions, from the fact that you have 2 target actions, 2 times in the game you can simply point at a sector and say what's in that sector, although again, empty space will still appear empty, whether or not Planet X is in there. From the scanning actions you can take and the way you can try to broadband the galaxy, try to scan different sections of the galaxy to give you information you need, whether you're scanning for different object types of dwarf planets or asteroids or whatever, each different planet type you try to go for, each different object you try to scan for is different, and the information it gives you is different depending on what you already know. You see, you can start the game with a few facts already, and additionally there's going to be research conferences that'll give you random facts. You know, dwarf comets are, but all dwarf comets are next to an asteroid this game, or empty space will be next to at least 1 comet, and you get these little pieces of information that will slowly put together the puzzle of info you have in front of you, giving you a lot of pathways for deduction. I love the orientation of the player sheets. This is a quality of life thing, but each player sheet has a little marker on it, and you align that marker with the section on the galaxy, on the section of the board, so you're never really faced with this concept of having to like mentally rotate your sheet to the board. It's a small quality of life thing, but it really works nicely so that my 14 is aligned there, your 14 is aligned there, and everything works perfectly. No mental twisting, because otherwise, if you didn't have that, you will make mistakes as you mark things on the board based on your orientation and not based on how they actually are, and marking things down incorrectly on your board will lead you down a pathway of wrongness. Just wrongness escalated and built upon further wrongness, so I'm very happy they have that quality of life thing. And I like the fact that you can win without finding Planet X, or not being the first person to find Planet X. I like the fact that Planet X is but a factor in the galaxy, because otherwise it could come down to a game where you get Planet X first, and it just feels like, okay, you got a little lucky here with this fact or that fact. I like the fact that the game is giving you a lot of other points around the game engine, and Planet X is important. You should not leave it alone, not by a long shot, but it is not the be-all and end-all in the game. And lastly, the solo play in Search for Planet X is great. The solo play, because the game is anyways multiplayer solitaire, because the game is anyways doing your own thing without that much regard for what other players are doing, I like the solo play a lot for this game. You pull up the app, you do your thing, the robot moves, the robot scans, rinse and repeat until you figure out the puzzle. Ultimately, the Search for Planet X is a logical deduction game, and if you like logical deduction, you're going to like it whether or not there are other players at the table with you. As far as things I didn't like, there's going to be 2, and they're kind of tied together to a degree. The first is the fact that it's multiplayer solitaire. While I do like deduction games in general, I like the collaborative feeling of figuring things out together. We'll talk about this more about recommendations at the end of the video, but I like other deduction games where you're working together as opposed to working on your own. It feels fun to like be figuring things out together. So you have those moments of, ooh, what about this and what about that, and figuring out the logic together, and this is very much multiplayer solitaire. The second thing ties into the first because it depends on how you play this game. Strictly speaking, you have the ability to record other players' moves in this action sheet. I can say that the red player took a scan action on sectors 11 through 14 for asteroids. Now you don't know what they found out. You just know that they scanned that. You just know what they did. And so if you are paying enough attention, if you are writing down other players' actions, it is theoretically possible that you can escalate this outwards from multiplayer solitaire to be a bit more strategic, as I take into account, well, if you're searching for asteroids in 12 through 15, that means that X, Y, and Z. So if you're paying enough attention, you can get a little bit of information there. I will say that speaking for myself and the people I've played this game with, nobody has bothered to track that information. Because I would say most of the time, the amount of information you can glean from following others' actions is minimal, most of the time. Once in a while, there are key moments. If I'm trying to figure out whether asteroids are here or here, and I hear you scan there, it might give me the information I need to subdivide between 2 things I have going on. But those turns where it's obvious based on what you do, and I can follow, are usually rare. Usually I'd have to be following your stuff to a high degree, and again, if you're playing this game differently, entirely possible you're getting a lot more out of other players' turns. For everyone I've played this game with, we mostly don't care what you're doing. So I'm specifically including that here because it might affect your opinion on whether it's multiplayer solitaire if you heavily dive into that. We don't, and so this game feels like a multiplayer solitaire experience. As far as things I can see others not liking in the game, early luck can drive the game for one player over another. The game, at the end of the day, is strategy. It is deduction. It's going to reward skilled players who can see those pathways. But at the same time, while that's true, if I make a scan early game that gives me information that is useful, and you make a scan early game that gives you information that's not, which absolutely can happen, not because one player is a better player, but just because we both made a reasonable move, and one of us was rewarded with information the other one was not. Although, to be fair, not being rewarded with information often is information. I mean, even once you account for that, if your scan just gave you less information you can take out of it than mine did, and yet now we're building on these castles, these towers of information, but my foundation is stronger and my further scans are even better. So you can have luck of the draw in a sense when you scan for different things as far as getting, that information. And then secondly, I would say it can be hard to properly note and track the logic. In general, you can mark your own things, you can mark the various conference results, you can mark everything on the sheet, but it can be hard to kind of get everything down. There's a lot of information going on, and if you make a single wrong notation somewhere, it can drive you forward in all the wrong sort of ways. Bringing us to final thoughts on the Search for Planet X. I like the Search for Planet X a lot with caveats. The deduction game is one of the strongest I've seen in any deduction games. And one thing I even forgot to mention in the what I like section is I love how the app gives the players the option to scale for different player levels. Meaning you begin the game and you can choose how many facts you want to receive. So if I'm playing the game and I've played this game 6 times and you're jumping for the first time, I can give you 12 facts, 12 pieces of information you have, while I take none for myself, and that can balance for multiple skill levels, which is one of my biggest problems usually in deduction games, that people who have played it before know the core mechanics, the core rules, they've locked in that muscle memory of how if this then that means that, and so players can win. So I love the fact that it has that. And like I said already, the core deduction, the variableness of the galaxy, this is a solid game that to me is marred by one thing and one thing only, which is the multiplayer solitaire aspect of the game. I find that whenever I sit down and play this game solo, I'm like, this is such a good game, I love it, and then I play it with other players and I'm like, I could have just played that solo. I didn't need the other players here. Now, it's worth noting, if you look on Board Game Geek, this isn't rated best as a solo game. My own bias towards this as being best at solo is my own bias, and that may not be your experience. I just found that playing the game with other players was fine. I mean, I liked it, I didn't mind it, but I'd rather play a more interactive experience when I am playing with others. Me looking at my app, you looking at your app, I take an action, I move, I ask you, you take an action, you move, I write things down, I advance the theory, okay, great, now, okay, I found planet X. At no point do we ever really communicate. The most level of interaction with others is when we say, oh, was your theory right or not? And that's helpful, and then we move on, but I get that from the robot AI computer at the same time. Search for Planet X is a 3.5 out of 5 for me. Really solid game, really enjoyable, some of the best deduction I've seen in a board game, but marred a bit by an experience that, and marred is relative, I like interaction in my games, and marred a bit by that complete lack of any real interaction, at least based on the way we play. It's important to caveat, other players might get more information or more out of other players' scans. If you like this and you're looking for other game recommendations, I can recommend Awkward Guess is a very highly rated game that I have not dived into myself yet. I've read the rules, I'm going to be at some point, I'll talk about that later, but Awkward Guess is a very well rated deduction game. And then Pachamama is not actually out, but I'm still going to bring it up here, because Pachamama, which is an upcoming Kickstarter, is one that I think for me gave me the closest general feeling of the deduction of Planet X versus Pachamama, although Pachamama I felt was more interactive, possibly to the detriment of the game mechanically, but more interactive all the same. In any case, until next time, I am Alex Radcliffe from Board Game Co. I hope you found this review helpful, and as always, have a good one.